Only the worst and most desperate of clergy were dispatched to the living at Black Sands. For the community had long resisted the intrusions of organized religion. There were exceptions, of course. There was a duty upon the church and its clergy not to allow a community to exist without the light of the true faith to guide it. And so it was given to me as my first meagre living. From the rectory window, I could see the ghosts of the waves descending upon the dark shore, white on black. When they broke, it was as if the very sands had devoured them. The church itself was a humble thing, close by the beach, and the village was little more than a huddle of small houses spread over 5 or 6 narrow streets. There was a shop devoted to the sale of whatever the residents might require, from a clothes peg to a cartwheel, and beside it stood a small pub. Both premises were owned by the unofficial mayor of Black Sands, a Mr. Webster. He was a tall, cadaverous man, with the manner of an undertaker measuring up a particularly impoverished client for a cheap coffin. He politely declined my request to post the times of services in either of his premises.
"As I informed your predecessor, we have no need of your presence here," he informed me, with a half-smile as he walked with me along the main street of the village. "I am no theologian, but it seems to me that there are many religions and many gods. There are other gods than yours, Mr. Benson, older gods. Each has a place. That I do not doubt. Unfortunately, the place for yours is not here." "I choose to stay," I replied. He shrugged. "Then we may yet find a use for you."
The whispering began early in November. At first it sounded like the wind in the grass, but when I went to my window, the branches of the trees appeared unmoving. Still it came, sometimes soft, sometimes keening, speaking words I could not understand. I glimpsed a light moving on the promontory to the north, where a circle of old stones stood. My curiosity aroused, I dressed hastily, and wrapped in my dark coat, made my way through the fields toward the path that led to the ancient site. I was almost within sight of the trail when some instinct made me fall to the ground. 2 shapes appeared on the path above me, the forms of men marching silently along. Webster stood, waiting for them at the circle, a lantern resting upon the flat stone before him. He was dressed in his usual tweeds, the tail of his overcoat flapping in the breeze. "Do you have it?" he said. One of the 2 men who had joined him, a dour farmer named Prater, handed over something white, a cleric's stole. One had gone missing from my washing line earlier in the week, and I had been driven almost to distraction trying to guess what might have happened to it. Now I knew. Webster picked up his lantern. Instantly his face was illuminated, but it seemed to me that I saw regret there. Or, so I hope now, in the light of what was to occur later. "It has to be done," said Prater. "It's the way of things." Webster shook his head slightly. "There will soon come a time when it will no longer be possible," he said. "And what then?" asked the 3rd man, whose name I did not know. "Then the old ones will be forgotten, and the new will take their place." He picked up the stole, and he and his companions walked down to the beach. There they dug a hole in the sand and placed the garment within, before carefully covering up the hole once again. Then they returned to the village. I stayed where I was for a time, until I was certain that they would not return, then followed the path they had taken down to the shore. It was the work of only a few moments to find the little mound left by them, beneath which the remains of my church garment lay. I stood there for a time, uncertain of how to proceed.
I was terribly afraid and prayed for guidance, but none came. Instead, feeling that I was betraying the very faith I had so ardently defended to Webster, I removed my stole and returned to the rectory. The next day, I rose early and made my way into the village. I stopped by Webster's pub as he was making his preparations for the day. He found it hard to meet my gaze, but I gave no indication that I recognized his unease. "I was wondering," I said, "if I could trouble you for a cup of tea. I must confess I feel a little weak this morning and in need of something to fortify me for the walk home."
"Why, I could give you something stronger than tea, if you like," he said. "Tea will be fine," I said, and watched as he disappeared into the kitchen behind the bar in order to heat the water. He was gone for only a couple of minutes, but in that time I did all that I needed to do. From the pocket of his jacket, which always hung on a hook behind the bar, I removed a worn white handkerchief, praying to God to forgive me as I did so. Then, once Webster returned, I sat with him and drank my tea, maintaining a pretense of normality, while fearing throughout that he might sniffle or sneeze, causing him to search for his handkerchief. When I was done, I offered him money for the tea, but he refused. "On the house," he said, "just to show there are no hard feelings." "None whatsoever," I said, before I walked to the seashore and buried his handkerchief in the coarse, dark sand. I did not sleep that night, so that when I heard my name being called, I was almost expecting the summons. Webster was below my window, a lamp in his hand. "You must come quickly," he shouted. "There is a body on the seashore." I left my bed, pulled on my clothes and shoes, and descended to the door, but Webster was already running ahead of me by the time I got it open. "Come on," he cried. "Hurry!" I paused and drew a stout birch stick from my umbrella stand. I followed Webster's light until I arrived at the edge of the dunes looking down on the beach. Where the waves were breaking, a black bundle lay. Ahead of me, Webster was beckoning, calling me closer, but the bundle at his feet remained unmoving, even when I knelt down beside it in the light and probed gently at it. Slowly, my hands shaking, I drew back the damp black cloth that covered it. It was a dog. A dead dog. I looked up to find Webster's light beginning to recede from me as he tried to leave me alone on the beach. I was about to stand when I was momentarily distracted by a stinging sensation against my face. I brushed at the spot, and my fingers came away with a coating of black sand. All around me the grains were moving, shifting. Shapes rose and fell, forming columns that held their shape for an instant before disintegrating into dark clouds that fell onto the beach below. They might almost have been human. I thought I discerned horns emerging from their heads, warped and twisted growths that appeared to curl round their skulls, ending at their necks. The whispering began, and I understood at last that it was not language I had heard on past nights, but the movement of the sands, the individual molecules brushing against each other, reconstituting themselves in strange configurations. Clawed feet, taloned hands, and lidless eyes appeared, as if beings buried beneath the surface were somehow finding a means of expressing their ancient, lost forms. Now Webster was running, making for the safety of the dunes and the raised stone slab that rested on the promontory. I followed him, my progress arrested by the sponge-like quality of the terrain. Behind me, I sensed a form rising high, and then sand was filling my eyes and mouth like fingers clasped suddenly across my face. I spat and wiped at my face with my sleeve, but did not look over my shoulder. Ahead of me, Webster was tiring. I narrowed the gap between us by another 5 or 6 feet, then threw my stick with all the force I could muster. It struck him firmly on the back of the head, and he tumbled awkwardly to the ground. He tried to rise, but I caught him a glancing blow with my foot. I clutched at a patch of marram grass, drew myself up, and looked down on the black sands.
"You can't escape," he called. "These are the old gods, the true gods."
He stood and rubbed the sand from his clothes. He appeared wary of the approaching forms, but not fearful.
"Embrace it," Webster continued. "This is your death." "No," I cried. "It's not my death, and these are not my gods."
And I removed from my pocket the stained cloth of my stole and displayed it to him. And as the realization dawned, Webster was surrounded by what appeared to be columns of swirling grains. I saw him try to break through, but the intensity of their movement increased, blinding him and forcing him back. And then, of a sudden, they disappeared, and all was still. Webster's thin form was left standing alone in the dying light from the burning oil. All movement had ceased on the beach. He raised his head uncertainly to me and reached out a hand. Instinctively I lay down and stretched out my own hand to him. Whatever he had tried to do to me, I could not leave him in peril. Our fingers were almost touching when a shape appeared close by Webster's feet. I saw an oval of sand rise up with two holes about midway down its form, like the sunken sockets of eyes. The bridge of a ruined nose stretched between them, framed on either side by a pair of jagged cheekbones. And then, around Webster's feet, a maw opened. I saw lips and a brief glimpse of what might have been some kind of tongue, all carved from black sand. Webster looked down and started to scream, but the thing began to suck him down. He struck at the shape, his fingers clawing as he attempted to arrest his descent, but soon he was submerged to his chest, then his neck. His mouth opened wide once more, but any further sound he made was silenced by the grains that filled his mouth as his head disappeared beneath the sand. Now the chapel at Black Sands once more lies empty. Barbed wire has been erected around the beach, and warning signs posted advising people to stay away. But Webster was right. The old gods will not be so easily forgotten. Sometimes the wind blows along this desolate stretch of coastline and causes shapes to rise up from the beach. Phantasms of sand that hold their form for just an instant too long before falling in small heaps to the ground. It may take years, even decades, to complete the process, but they will succeed, for slowly and surely they are obscuring the warning signs.